Who does she think she is? And it is just a test. Nothing special about her.
Melody did not even bother to lower her voice, standing right there in the middle of the corridor with her arms folded, and her chin lifted the way a queen lifts hers before she orders someone out of the room. Her two best friends, Precious and Thandika, laughed right on cue, because that is what they did. They laughed when Naledi laughed. They frowned when Naledi frowned. And on the days Naledi decided someone needed to be destroyed, they handed her the weapons with a smile. The girl they were talking about had no idea any of this was happening. She was still at her desk, carefully sliding her answer paper into her folder like it was something worth keeping. Her worn-out backpack sitting on the floor beside her chair looking like it had survived 3 wars and a flood. Her school shoes were polished to a shine that honestly had no business being that bright on shoes that old, and her uniform was pressed so crisply you could almost hear it. She was not trying to impress anyone. That was the thing. She simply came from a home where you did things properly or you did not do them at all. Her name was Linda Dlamini. She was 16 years old, and she had absolutely no idea she had just made the most dangerous enemy in Mthakazisi High School. 3 weeks before that corridor moment, Linda was sitting on a plastic chair outside the principal's office of her old school in Soweto, waiting while her mother argued quietly with the secretary about bus fare to get to the scholarship interview in Santon. Her mother, Agnes Dlamini, was a woman who ironed other people's clothes for a living and never once complained about it. But she had a way of negotiating that made grown men reconsider their life choices, and by the end of that conversation, she had secured a printed bus schedule, a borrowed blazer from the secretary's own daughter, and enough taxi fare to get Linda across 3 suburbs without losing her dignity. The scholarship interview was held inside a building with a glass elevator, and Linda had to remind herself not to stare at it. She answered every question in that interview room calmly and clearly, not because she was not nervous, but because Agnes had spent the previous night sitting across the kitchen table from her, asking her practice questions in a serious voice, and then immediately doing impressions of the interviewers until Linda was laughing so hard she forgot to be afraid. By morning, she was ready. She walked into that glass building, took the stairs because she did not fully trust the elevator, and came out an hour later with a full academic scholarship to Mthakazisi High School, one of the best schools in all of Gauteng. Agnes cried the whole taxi ride home, but very quietly, because she was Agnes Dlamini and she had a reputation to maintain. Mthakazisi High sat behind iron gates at the top of a long driveway lined with jacaranda trees, the kind of school that appeared in the background of television commercials whenever they needed to signal success. The buildings were old and solid, the kind built to last, with wide corridors and trophy cabinets that lined the walls from the front entrance all the way to the administration block. The sports fields were green and trimmed, the library had actual new books in it, and the teachers wore lanyards with their names printed on them in a clean sans serif font that somehow made everything feel more official. On Linda's first morning, she stood at the school gate for exactly 4 seconds longer than necessary, took a breath, and walked in. The first person to acknowledge her existence was a boy named Saifo Kumalo, who was running at full speed through the corridor with a half-eaten fetcook in one hand and his blazer inside out, and who nearly knocked her completely off her feet before grabbing her arm at the last second to steady her, apologizing in 3 languages simultaneously, then disappearing around a corner before she could respond. She would later learn that Saifo was always running, always eating, and always wearing something incorrectly, and that these 3 qualities made him the most reliably entertaining person in the school. The second person to notice her was Naledi Makona. Naledi had been head girl for 8 months, which in Mthakazisi High terms meant she had been in power for 2 full terms and had spent every single one of those days making sure everyone understood what that meant. She was not simply the girl with the badge on her blazer. She was the girl who decided which tables were the good tables in the cafeteria, which clubs survived, and which ones quietly dissolved, which new students settled in easily, and which ones found every single day a little bit harder than it needed to be. She was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, the kind of student whose essays the teachers read aloud as examples, and whose name appeared on every honor board in the school. And this was precisely what made her so dangerous, because nobody wanted to believe that someone so accomplished could also be so deliberately cruel. Her father was Advocate Makona, whose name appeared on billboards in Rosebank, and her mother sat on the school governing board, and Naledi had understood from a very young age that in this world, The people who hold the most power are the ones who make the rules about what power even looks like. She saw Lindive on that first day the way a cat sees a bird land on the windowsill, with a slow, assessing stillness that looked like calm, but was actually something else entirely. Precious Ndlovu was Nality's oldest friend and her most devoted one. The kind of devoted that had slowly eaten away at whatever opinions Precious used to have of her own until there was almost nothing left but loyalty and nail appointments. She was not unkind by nature. This was the sad part. She was actually quite funny and occasionally generous. But she had tied herself so completely to Nality's version of reality that she had forgotten she was allowed to have a different one. She laughed at Lindive in that corridor because Nality was laughing, but there was a half second, just a half second, where her eyes flicked toward Lindive's polished shoes, and something that looked almost like recognition passed across her face before she buried it. Thandika Sithole was a different situation altogether. She was not following Nality out of love or loyalty or history. She was following her because Thandika was strategic. She had assessed the social landscape of Mthakazisi High with the cold precision of someone playing a very long game, and she had decided that standing next to Nality was the safest square on the board. She smiled at all the right moments, said very little, and remembered everything. Then there was Mr. Dlamini, no relation to Lindive, the life orientation teacher who had worked at Mthakazisi High for 11 years and had long ago made a private arrangement with himself that the best way to survive was to see less, hear less, and mark papers correctly, which he did with great dedication. He was not a bad man, he was a tired one, and there is a particular kind of damage that tired people do simply by deciding not to look. And there was Mrs. Komatsu, the deputy principal, who wore the same 3 blazers in rotation and who had a framed quote above her desk that read "Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment," which would have been inspiring if she did not apply it exclusively to uniform violations and never to anything more important. The surprise test happened on a Wednesday, during double mathematics, when Mr. Osei put down his chalk, turned from the board with the energy of a man who had been waiting all term to do exactly this, and said, "Close your textbooks, take out one piece of paper, and write your name clearly at the top." The entire class made the sound that students have made in every country in every century whenever a surprise test is announced. A collective noise somewhere between a groan and a small prayer, and then 32 students reached for their pens with varying degrees of confidence. Lindive looked at the questions, felt something settle in her chest the way things settle when you are in familiar territory, and began to write. 40 minutes later, Mr. Osei collected the papers, and class continued. Nobody thought much about it. The following morning he walked in holding a small stack of marked scripts, set them on his desk, and said, "I am going to return these one at a time, and I want no drama," which was of course the single most effective way to ensure there would be drama. He called Nality's name first, walked over, and placed the paper face down on her desk, then moved on. Nality flipped it over, and her expression stayed perfectly composed. A 74, good, respectable, the kind of mark that maintained her position without requiring her to act grateful about it. Then Mr. Osei called Lindive's name, walked to where she sat at the second-to-last row near the window, and placed her paper down. Then he said, quietly but not quietly enough, "Excellent work, Lindive. This is the highest mark in the class." The room shifted in that way rooms shift when something has changed, and everyone feels it before they understand it. Lindive looked at her paper, 96, circled in red pen with 2 small lines underneath it, and she did not whoop or wave it around or turn to see who was watching. She simply nodded to herself, folded it carefully, and slid it into her folder like it was something worth keeping. Which is exactly when Nality looked over, really looked for the first time. It started small, the way all dangerous things start small. On Thursday, Lindive's lunch disappeared from the classroom while she was in the bathroom. Just her lunch, nobody else's. She bought a fete cook from the school tuck shop, ate it without complaint, and did not mention it to anyone. On Friday, someone had written "New Girl" in permanent marker on the inside cover of her mathematics textbook. She looked at it for a moment, then wrote her name neatly above it in blue pen, Lindive Dlamini, Mthakazisi High, grade 10, because if someone wanted to acknowledge she was new, the least they could do was get her name right. On Monday, Precious walked past her in the corridor with 3 other girls and said loudly that some people got scholarships because schools needed to hit a certain number, not because they actually deserved to be there. The 3 girls laughed. 2 of them did not even know why they were laughing. They were simply responding to a social cue the way people do when they are more afraid of being on the wrong side than of doing the wrong thing. Lindive kept walking. But something was building behind her eyes, something quiet and patient, like water finding the shape of whatever container holds it, and Nality, watching from across the courtyard, mistook that patience for weakness. That was her first mistake. The school talent showcase happened on the last Friday of the month, a whole school event held in the main hall with colored lights that the student council had spent 2 weeks arguing about, and a sound system that worked perfectly during rehearsals and developed opinions during the actual show. Students had signed up to sing, recite poetry, perform traditional dance, play instruments, and in Saifo Kumalo's case, perform a comedy routine that the teachers had approved after reading a version that was significantly tamer than the one he actually performed. Lindive had signed up to recite a poem she had written herself, in both Zulu and English, about her mother's hands. She was backstage, reading it through one last time, her lips moving slightly, when Nality appeared. "There is a problem with the running order," Nality said, clipboard in hand, head girl badge catching the light, face arranged into something that almost looked helpful. "Can you come and check something in the storage room? It will take 2 minutes." Lindive looked at her for 1 beat longer than was polite. Then she followed. The storage room behind the gymnasium smelled like old sports equipment and decades of ambition, and the moment Lindive stepped inside, she heard the door click shut behind her, and then the sound of a key turning, and then Nality's heels walking away at a pace that was not running, but was certainly not strolling. Lindive turned and pushed the door once firmly, already knowing it was pointless. She stood in the dark and listened to the muffled sound of the showcase beginning without her, the opening music she recognized, the MC's voice, then applause, then more music, and she sat down on a dusty equipment box and thought about her mother ironing other people's clothes at 5 in the morning to pay for the taxi fare to her scholarship interview. And she did not cry, not one tear, but something inside her went very, very still. That is when her foot touched something on the floor. She reached down and picked it up, and even in the dark she could see it, a bracelet, thin and simple, the kind of thing that should not have been glowing, and yet it was a soft and steady pink light that made no attempt to explain itself. She held it for a moment. Then she put it on. The door swung open. Not slowly, not dramatically, it simply opened, the way a door opens when it was never really locked to begin with, or when whatever was keeping it shut has decided it is done. Lindive walked out of the storage room, brushed the dust from her uniform, straightened her collar, and walked toward the hall. She was going to recite her poem. She was going to recite it now. And somewhere in the audience, Nality was about to discover that the girl she had locked in the dark had not sat there quietly waiting to be let out. She had sat there and become something else. The hall was mid-applause when Lindive walked in through the side door, smoothed her skirt with both hands, and took her place in the queue of performers waiting at the edge of the stage curtain. Saifo was standing next to her, still buzzing from his comedy routine, his collar twisted and his tie slightly singed from where he had gotten too close to one of the stage lights, and he took one look at her face and said, "You good?" in the quiet way people ask that question when they already suspect the answer is complicated. "I am excellent," Lindive said, and her voice was so steady that Saifo blinked, because it did not sound like the voice of someone who had just been locked in a dark storage room. It sounded like the voice of someone who had gone into that room one person and come out a completely different arrangement of the same girl. The bracelet on her wrist caught the stage light and threw a faint pink shimmer across the curtain, and Saifo stared at it for a second, then looked at her, then looked at it again. "Nice bracelet." "Thank you," Lindive said, and walked onto the stage. She stood at the microphone and looked out at the audience, 200 students and a row of teachers, and Mrs. Komatsu with her arms folded, and her expression set to its default position of mild suspicion. And at the far end of the front row, Nality, sitting with her clipboard on her lap, and her legs crossed, and her face wearing the precise expression of someone who is certain they have won. Lindive began. She recited the poem in Zulu first, her grandmother's language, her mother's language, the language that lived in the part of her chest that no scholarship interview or polished school corridor could reach. And the hall went quiet in the particular way halls go quiet when something real is happening, and everyone can feel it even if they cannot name it. Then she switched to English, and a girl in the third row started crying, which she would later blame on allergies, and 2 of the teachers exchanged a look over their grade registers that said very clearly, "Where did this child come from?" When she finished, the applause started slowly, and then became something else, the kind that fills the room from the floor up, and Lindive looked directly at Nality, held that look for exactly 3 seconds, then walked calmly off the stage. Naledi's clipboard slid off her lap and hit the floor, and Precious had to pretend she had not noticed. That night, Lindive sat on her bed in the boarding house dormitory she shared with 5 other girls, the room quiet and dark and smelling of cocoa butter and someone's contraband 2-minute noodles, and she looked at the bracelet. It was not doing anything dramatic. It was not spinning or sparking or whispering ancient secrets in a spooky voice. It was simply sitting on her wrist, warm and faintly luminous, the way something feels when it belongs there. But the knowing was undeniable. She knew, with a clarity she could not explain and did not try to, that Bontel in grade 9B had been giving Naledi's crew 30 rands every Monday for the past 2 terms because they had threatened to tell the teachers she had a boyfriend at another school, which was not even against any actual school rule. But Bontel was 11 and afraid, and did not know that yet. She knew that the 60 rand lunch money, missing from Yandis's blazer pocket last Tuesday, had ended up in Precious's phone airtime account. She knew that Mr. Dlamini had seen Naledi's crew corner a grade 8 boy named Lethabo behind the tuck shop 3 weeks ago, and that he had turned around and walked back the way he came, and that the guilt of it was currently living inside him like a stone he carried around and pretended was not there. She knew where the notebook was. That was the important one, the notebook, a small blue exercise book that Thandika kept at the bottom of her locker behind her physical science textbooks, in which she had written, in her neat and methodical handwriting, a record of every collection, every threat, every student name, every amount dating back 14 months, because Thandika was strategic and strategic people keep records. They just do not always consider who else might one day read them. Lindive turned off her bedside lamp, pulled her blanket up, and stared at the ceiling. She was not angry, which surprised her. She had expected anger. She had been ready for it. But what she felt instead was something quieter and more purposeful, like a compass that has finally found north and simply points, without drama, without noise, in the direction of the thing that needs to happen. She closed her eyes. By morning, she had a plan. It started with Bontel. Lindive found her on Monday before first period, sitting alone on the steps outside the science block with her 30 rands already out and her eyes already resigned, and Lindive sat down next to her and said, very conversationally, "You know that having a boyfriend is not in the school code of conduct, right? I checked." Bontel looked at her like she had just spoken in a language Bontel had never heard, but had always suspected existed. "It is not a rule," Lindive continued, pulling out a folded piece of paper on which she had written the exact relevant sections of the school's disciplinary policy, which she had found in the library's reference section because of course the library had it. "So there is nothing they can actually report you for, and if they try, they will have to explain in front of Mrs. Komatsu exactly why they knew about your personal life in such detail. And I do not think they want that conversation." Bontel stared at the paper, then at Lindive, then at the 30 rands in her hand. She put the money back in her pocket. Then she burst into tears, which was not the response Lindive had planned for, but she sat there anyway and let it happen. Because sometimes people cry not because they are sad, but because something heavy has been lifted so suddenly that the body does not know how to respond to the lightness. The anonymous notes began appearing that same week. They were written on plain white paper in a handwriting that nobody could quite place, and they were specific in a way that anonymous notes are usually not. They did not say things like "I know what you did." They said things like, "Yandisa, your 60 rands from last Tuesday is in an envelope in the lost property box outside the admin office. Ask Mrs. Sithole to open it for you." They said things like, "Lethabo, what happened behind the tuck shop on the 14th was not your fault, and it was witnessed, and the witness is no longer staying quiet." They said things like, "Grade 8 and 9 students, you are not required by any school rule to hand over money to prefects, and if anyone tells you otherwise, the relevant policy section number is listed below." The notes were folded into quarters and left in specific places, inside specific lockers, under specific chairs, tucked into the pages of specific library books that specific people had recently returned, and the precision of the placement was the part that made people's skin prickle, because it suggested that whoever was writing them knew not just the facts, but the geography of everyone's quiet suffering. By Wednesday of that same week, the story had already started. It began the way all good school rumors begin, with one person telling 2 people something that was mostly true and slightly embellished, and those 2 people each telling 3 more, and so on, until the original fact was still technically present somewhere inside the story, but surrounded now by so many additional details that it had become something richer and stranger and considerably more interesting. What had actually happened was this. A grade 11 girl named Refilwe had come back to campus after netball practice at 7 in the evening to retrieve a jersey she had left in the change rooms, and on her way back across the school grounds, she had seen, in the low orange light near the back gate, a figure in a pink top who moved quickly and quietly and was gone before Refilwe could be sure she had really seen anything at all. What the story became, by Thursday morning, was considerably more atmospheric. By Thursday morning, the figure had been seen 3 times by multiple people and had grown a pink glow and had been heard whispering and had left no footprints, and Sifo had added, entirely without evidence but with great conviction, that his cousin's friend who went to a school in Pretoria had heard about something similar happening there 2 years ago, which was a complete fabrication but delivered with such casual confidence that 4 people wrote it down. By Friday she had a name. The Pink Lady. Naledi heard it on Friday morning, and her reaction was one of the few times in recent memory that her face did something she had not given it permission to do. She was in the prefect's room, going through the week's report with Thandika, when Precious burst in with the expression of someone delivering news they find both alarming and, privately, a little bit exciting. "There is a rumor," Precious said, catching her breath, "about a girl. They're calling her the Pink Lady. They say she has been moving around the school at night, and she knows things, like actually knows things. Yandisa got her 60 rands back, and Bontal told Naledi's crew she is not paying anymore, and there are notes, Naledi, actual notes with policy sections cited in them." A silence followed that was notably different from the usual silences in that room. "Policy sections," Naledi repeated. "Cited," Precious confirmed. Thandika's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward the zip of her school bag, and then stopped, and then moved back to the table very casually. And Naledi did not notice because she was looking at Precious, but Lindybe, had she been in the room, would have noticed immediately. "Find out who it is," Naledi said, and her voice had a new texture in it, not quite fear, but the thing that lives next door to fear and borrows its mannerisms. The campaign Naledi launched over the following 2 weeks was thorough, organized, and completely misdirected. She had her prefects monitoring the school grounds after hours. She had Precious casually interrogating every girl in grade 10 and 11 about their whereabouts on the evenings in question. She had Thandika compile a list of students who had been behaving unusually, meaning students who had recently stopped being afraid, which turned out to be a longer list than expected and growing daily. She pulled in favors from teachers she had cultivated over 2 terms of strategic helpfulness, student council members who owed her, even the tuck shop lady who saw everything from her little window and had, until now, chosen to see nothing. None of it led anywhere near Lindybe Dlamini, who attended every class, completed every assignment, sat at her usual spot in the cafeteria with Sifo and a quiet girl named Amara from her dormitory, and behaved with such consistent and unremarkable normalcy that she had effectively made herself invisible by being exactly where everyone expected her to be at all times. "It is not her," Precious said one afternoon, watching Lindybe eat a sandwich with the focused, unhurried energy of someone with absolutely nothing to hide. "Obviously," Naledi agreed. They were both wrong in a way that would become embarrassing in public. It was Thandika who came closest to the truth, because Thandika was the smartest person in that room, and she knew it, even if she had spent 2 years making sure Naledi did not fully realize it. She had noticed, without mentioning it to anyone, that the notes had started appearing the same week as the talent showcase, that they were specific about information that should have been private, that they never accused without also providing a solution, and that whoever was writing them understood the school's administrative systems well enough to know exactly which policy to cite, and exactly where the lost property box was kept, and exactly how to move through a school of 500 students without being seen. She sat with this knowledge for a week. Then she went to check her locker. The notebook was still there, exactly where she had left it, behind the physical science textbooks, and she stood in front of her open locker for a long moment, breathing, and then she picked it up and held it and understood that it had not been moved, but that it had been read somehow by someone, and that the only reason she still had it was because whoever had read it had decided to give her time. Time to do the right thing herself. She closed her locker, put the notebook in her blazer pocket, and went to find a phone. The call she made that evening was to her older sister in Cape Town, who was in her 2nd year of law school and who listened to the whole story without interrupting, which took considerable self-control, and when Thandika finished, her sister said, "You kept records of everything." "Yes. Then you already have what you need to fix this," her sister said. The question is whether you are going to fix it, or whether you are going to keep being the person who watches and says nothing. Thandika hung up and sat on her bed and looked at the ceiling for a very long time. The school assembly happened on the last Monday of the month, a routine full school gathering in the main hall. The kind that usually involved Mrs. Komatsu reading announcements about upcoming exams and reminding people about the correct length for school skirts, and then the head girl giving a short address, and then everyone going back to class in various states of mild boredom. Naledi stood at the podium in her blazer with her badge and her clipboard and her practiced authority, and began her address about school pride and academic excellence and the values that made Mthakazisi High what it was, and she was 3 minutes in and doing well when the hall's side door opened. Lindai walked in. She was wearing a pink dress, not school uniform, a dress, neat and simple, and exactly the color of the bracelet on her wrist, and the room noticed immediately, the way rooms notice when someone walks in who is not trying to be noticed, and that somehow is the most noticeable thing of all. She walked calmly to the front of the hall, and Mrs. Komatsu made a noise and started to rise from her chair, and Lindive said, clearly and without any particular drama, "Mrs. Komatsu, I need 2 minutes, and then you can decide what to do with what I have said." Something in her voice made Mrs. Komatsu sit back down. Something in her voice made everyone sit back down. She did not shout, she did not wave papers around, she did not perform. She stood at the front of that hall, and she spoke the way her mother negotiated bus fare, with a calm and a precision that left very little room for argument, and she named every act of abuse she knew about, with dates, with amounts, with the names of the students who had been targeted, and with the relevant school policy section that had been violated each time. She spoke for 11 minutes. By the 3rd minute, Bontal was standing up. By the 5th, Lethabo was standing. By the 7th, there were 14 students on their feet, and the hall had the quality of air before a storm, charged and still and full of something about to break. By the 9th minute, Precious had her face in her hands, and it was genuinely impossible to tell if she was crying from guilt or relief or some complicated mixture of both. But she was crying, really crying, the kind that does not care who is watching. And then Thandika stood up. She reached into her blazer pocket, walked to the front of the hall, and placed the blue notebook on the table in front of Mrs. Komatsu with a steadiness that cost her something real. And then she turned and walked back to her seat without looking at Naledi once. Naledi looked at the notebook. Then she looked at Lindai. And in that moment, the recognition arrived, all of it, the storage room, the locked door, the talent showcase, the notes, the pink lady, all of it landing on her face at once in a sequence that was, if you were not the person it was happening to, almost impressively expressive. Lindive looked back at her with an expression that was not triumphant, not cold, not satisfied in any dramatic way, just steady, the way a compass is steady, simply pointing at the thing that needed to happen and having pointed at it for long enough that it had happened. Mrs. Komatsu suspended Naledi that afternoon, pending a full disciplinary hearing, and the letter home to Advocate Makona was reportedly drafted and redrafted 4 times before the principal was satisfied with the firmness of the language. Mr. Dlamini went home that evening and sat in his car in his driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, and the following morning he arrived at school with the particular expression of a man who has decided to stop carrying a stone around, and he asked to see Mrs. Komatsu before first period. Saifo found Lindai in the corridor after the assembly, fell into step beside her, and said nothing for almost a full minute, which was a personal record, and then said, "So the bracelet." "Yes," Lindai said. "Right," Saifo said, nodding slowly, processing, and then, because he was Saifo, "Does it do anything else, like can it help me find my rugby boots because they have been missing since March, and at this point I have started to think they left on purpose?" Lindai laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the chest, and it echoed down the corridor, and a group of grade 8 students turned to look and saw nothing more and nothing less than a girl in a pink dress walking with her friend and laughing like someone who had just put something very heavy down and was still feeling the lightness of her own empty hands. Outside, the jacaranda trees along the driveway were dropping their purple flowers in the afternoon wind, covering the path to the gate in something that looked, from a distance, almost like a carpet, and the school, for the first time in 14 months, felt like a place where something had been repaired rather than simply maintained. But down the road, in a silver car with tinted windows, Advocate Makona sat with his phone to his ear, and the conversation he was having was not with his wife, and it was not about dinner, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has not yet decided to accept that he has lost. The pink lady had won this round. The next one was already being arranged. The badge was smaller than she expected. Lindive stood in Mrs. Komatsu's office on a Tuesday morning in August, 3 months after the assembly, and accepted the acting head girl badge with both hands the way her mother had taught her to accept anything of weight. And Mrs. Komatsu gave a short speech about responsibility and character that was genuinely moving and only slightly undermined by the fact that her blazer was on inside out and nobody in the room felt it was the right moment to mention it. Saifa was waiting outside the office door when she emerged, and when he saw the badge he made a noise that was somewhere between a cheer and a sob, pressed both hands to his chest, and said, "I knew this girl when she ate tuck shop fet cook alone. I am basically famous by association," and then ruined the moment entirely by tripping over his own shoelace. Some things do not change, and Saifo Kumalo is one of them, and this is largely a comfort. But the school was not fixed, and Lindive had never been naive enough to think it would be. There were students who smiled at her in the corridor with a warmth that did not reach their eyes, students who had benefited from Naladi's system in small ways and quietly mourned its absence, students who had decided, without evidence, that whatever came next would be worse, because that is what people decide when they have only ever known one kind of order and cannot yet imagine another. And then there were the notes in her locker. Not the kind she used to write, precise and purposeful and pointing toward solutions. These were different. These were the kind written by people who wanted her afraid, and signed in brief and escalating in a way that had a pattern to it, a pattern that felt organized rather than random, which was more unsettling than if they had simply been random. The first one said, "Enjoy it while it lasts." The second said, "Some things get worse before they get better, ask Naladi." The third one arrived on a Thursday morning with no words at all, just a photograph, printed on plain paper, of Lindive's mother's house in Soweto, taken from outside the gate, and something moved through Lindive's body when she saw it that was not quite fear but was fear's first cousin, the one who shows up when fear wants you to know it is nearby without committing to a full visit. She folded the photograph, put it in her blazer pocket, and went to class. She did not tell anyone, not yet, because she had not yet decided what telling anyone would cost, and Lindive Dlamini did not spend resources she had not yet counted. Naladi's brother was named Counselor Bongani Makona, and he was 34 years old and appeared on community notice boards in their ward, holding a shovel at various groundbreaking ceremonies with the energy of a man who had never actually used a shovel but had been photographed with one enough times that the distinction no longer felt important to him. He had called the school principal twice, and then once more through the governing board, and the pressure in those calls was the kind that does not announce itself as pressure. It arrives dressed as concern, as community interest, as a father's worry about precedent and fairness, and the reputation of a family that has given so much to this institution, and it sits in the room long after the call ends. The principal, Mr. Hadebe, was not a weak man, but he was a man with a mortgage and a school that needed its governing board functional, and a ward counselor who had friends in the provincial education department. And he sat behind his desk after the third call and stared at the wall for a long time. He had not yet done anything, but the fact that he was staring at the wall instead of immediately deciding not to was its own kind of answer. And Lindive, who heard about the calls from Mrs. Komatsu, who trusted Lindive more than she trusted the situation, understood exactly what that answer meant. The bracelet told her about Amma on a Wednesday. It did not speak. It was not that kind of bracelet. It simply grew warm in the way it grew warm when something needed her attention, a steady and insistent heat that started during afternoon break and pulled her gaze, without explanation, toward the far corner of the lower school courtyard. Aman Kosi was 12 years old and small for her age, with a school bag that was too big for her and a habit of walking close to walls the way people walk close to walls when they have learned that open spaces are where things happen to you. She was sitting alone on a low bench eating half a sandwich, and 3 grade 8 girls were standing nearby doing the thing that is technically nothing, but is actually everything, laughing too loudly at jokes calibrated to land just within her hearing, moving slightly closer every few minutes, performing a slow and patient encirclement that Amma was trying very hard to pretend she could not see. Lindive recognized it the way you recognize a song from the first 2 notes. She crossed the courtyard. The 3 girls clocked the head girl badge and rearranged their faces into expressions of perfect innocence, so quickly it was almost athletic, and Lindive looked at them for a moment with the calm of someone who has already read the notebook and knows the handwriting, then looked at Amma. "Walk with me," she said simply, and Amma gathered her half sandwich and her too big bag and followed with the careful gratitude of someone who has stopped expecting things to go in her favor. They walked once around the lower school block, and Amma said nothing for the first full minute, and Lindive let the silence sit, because she remembered how long it took to trust that a kindness was not a setup. Then Amma said quietly, "They took my bus money on Monday." "I know," Lindive said. Amma looked at her sideways. "How?" Lindive just looked back, and after a moment Amma's eyes dropped to the bracelet, and she stared at it for a few seconds with an expression that was part confusion and part something older than confusion, the look people get when something confirms a feeling they already had but could not name. "Is it true," Amma said carefully, "what they say about the pink lady?" "What do they say?" "That she knows things," Amma said. "That she found a bracelet in the dark, that she is the reason Nality is gone, that she is still here, watching." She paused. "Some of the Standard Sevens think she is a ghost." "Do you think she is a ghost?" Amma considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said finally. "I think she is just someone who decided not to look away." Lindai was quiet for a moment, feeling something move in her chest that she did not have a word for, something between recognition and grief, and the very specific tenderness you feel when you see yourself somewhere you were not expecting to find yourself. "Go to Mrs. Komatsu after school," she said. "Tell her what happened with the bus money. Tell her I sent you. She will listen." Amma nodded, pulling her bag strap up her shoulder. "And Amma," Lindai added, "stop walking next to walls. You are allowed to take up space in the middle." That evening Lindai sat on her bed with the bracelet in her palm, not on her wrist, just resting in her hand, and she thought about Counselor Makona's phone calls, and the photograph of her mother's gate, and the badge on her blazer, and the 3 grade 8 girls were forming their circle somewhere out there, already identifying the next Amma, because systems do not end just because you remove the person at the top. They simply look for a new person to stand there. She thought about the bracelet finding her in the dark, and how it had not given her power exactly. It had given her clarity, the ability to see what was already there, and the courage to move toward it instead of away. She thought about Amma saying, "I think she is just someone who decided not to look away." She put the bracelet back on, went to her desk, and spent the next 2 hours writing, not anonymous notes this time, a proper formal report, organized and evidence-based and addressed directly to the governing board, documenting the pressure campaign from Counselor Makona's office, the locker notes, the photograph, and requesting a formal investigation with the kind of language that Thandika's sister had helped her understand over 3 phone calls she had not mentioned to anyone. She signed it with her full name. Lindai Nombula Dlamini, acting head girl, Thakazisi High School. She was done being anonymous. The report landed on the governing board's table the following Monday, and what happened next happened quickly, because formal documented complaints have a momentum to them that phone calls from ward counselors do not, and within a week there were 2 board members asking questions that Counselor Makona had not prepared answers for. And by the end of that week the pressure on Mr. Hadebe had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the kind of pressure that pushes you toward a decision. It was the kind that warns you about which decisions have witnesses. Nality did not return. The locker notes stopped. Mr. Hadebe called Lindai into his office and told her, with the careful understatement of a man who had recently looked into an abyss and decided to take several large steps backward, that the school appreciated her commitment to its values, and Lindai nodded and thanked him and went back to class, and Saifo, who had been waiting outside again because he had apparently appointed himself her permanent hallway correspondent, raised both eyebrows in a question, and she gave him a thumbs up, and he punched the air and knocked someone's water bottle off a windowsill and apologized for the next 4 minutes. 3 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon when the jacarandas were doing their purple thing again, and the school had the easy, loosening quality of a place about to exhale into a weekend, Lindai found Amma sitting in the courtyard again, but differently this time, sitting in the middle of the bench, bag beside her instead of on her back, eating a full lunch. She was not alone. Bontal was there, and Lethabo, and a girl from Lindai's dormitory named Refilwi who had started checking in on Amma after Lindai mentioned, casually, that the younger girl was finding her footing, and the group of them were talking with the slightly chaotic energy of people who do not yet know each other well, but are discovering they might. Lindai stood at the edge of the courtyard and watched for a moment. Then she walked over, sat beside Amma, and talked about nothing important for 10 minutes, homework and weekend plans, and whether the tuck shop's new fat cook recipe was better or worse than the old one. which was a serious ongoing debate with strong opinions on all sides. When she got up to leave, she unclipped the bracelet. She held it out to Amma, who looked at it, then at her, with an expression that asked 3 questions at once, and Lindive said, quietly enough that only Amma could hear. "It found me when I needed it. I think it knows where it needs to go next. Take care of the ones who cannot take care of themselves yet, and when the time comes, you will know who to pass it to." Amma took it with both hands, the way you accept something of weight, and held it for a moment, and then slowly put it on. She sat up straight. Not performatively, not dramatically, just the natural straightening of someone from whom something heavy has been lifted, or perhaps someone who has just remembered that they were always allowed to take up more space than they had been given, and that the two things are sometimes the same. Lindai walked away across the courtyard, and she did not look back, not because she did not care, but because she trusted what she was leaving behind. And there is a particular kind of freedom in that, in walking away from something not because you are running, but because you are finished, because the work is done and the hands that will carry it forward are already holding it. Behind her, without any signal or announcement, Bontal shifted closer to Amma on the bench, and Lethabo sat down on her other side, and Refilwe pulled out her lunch and settled in, and the small circle tightened the way circles tighten when they are protecting something worth protecting, easy and quiet and deliberate. The bracelet caught the afternoon light and sent a faint pink shimmer across the courtyard wall. And somewhere in Soweto, Agnes Dlamini was ironing someone else's clothes at a table by the window, and she paused for just a moment and looked up. The way you look up when something you cannot explain tells you that your child is okay. More than okay. That your child has done something you would be proud of, and she nodded once to herself. The small nod of a woman who raised her daughter to walk into rooms that were not built for her and leave them better than she found them. Then she went back to the ironing. The legend did not end with Lindile. It never does. It only ever passes on.